to cold. So that's the cold shock response. That's stage one. Unfortunately, there is no habituation or adaptation or acclimatization to the incapacitation caused by neuromuscular cooling. So there is, if you go and study animals that live in cold environments, it's remarkable how little evidence there is of their adaptation in terms of their neuromuscular function, that short-term physical incapacitation. Of course, they have fur and they have blubber and there's lots of morphological adaptations, but they have no adaptation to that peripheral cooling impacting on their nerves and muscles. Indeed, animals that are active at low temperatures have a lower performance capability at those temperatures than their muscle systems are capable of at higher temperatures. So you may well adapt to the cold shock response. You might find it easier and easier to go into the cold water, but the time you've got before you are physically incapacitated doesn't change. And finally, there is also habituation of the shivering response. So with repeated immersions, your shivering response to going into cold water diminishes, and you develop what's called a hypothermic adaptation. And this is shown beautifully by Griff Pugh, physiologist back in the 50s. This is in the 1960s. There were enough people wanted to swim the channel that they used to have an annual race sponsored by the Daily Mail. And Griff Pugh these are the days when you were politically not required to be correct. So you could actually label your graphs thin man and fat man, or thin man and fat swimmer. Griff Pugh was a thin mountaineer, capable of swimming, but never been outdoors. And he compared his responses whilst resting in a cold bath and swimming in a cold bath with the then champion open water swimmer, a Greek guy called Jason Zerganos. And he found that the fat swimmer stayed warm when he swam in 16-degree water, whereas the thin man cooled rapidly. This was because this particular open water swimmer, Jason Zerganos, had a combination of fitness and fatness. So he was able to produce heat and retain it within his subcutaneous fat layer. But the real evidence of what was happening in terms of cold habituation came when they sat still in the cold water, because the thin man still cooled very quickly, but also Jason Zerganos cooled as quickly once he started cooling. It took a bit longer because he was fatter. And this is classic hypothermic adaptation. But the real difference is that Jason Zerganos here was sitting still, but Griff Pugh was shivering like mad, groaning, and had to be lifted from the bath, whilst Jason Zerganos was actually reading a newspaper and commenting how comfortable he felt. So the long-term habituation to cold decreases your shivering response. So these are people pre-acclimatization to cold and post-acclimatization to cold. This is shivering up the y-axis here, and this is body temperature here. And what you see is that for any given body temperature, when acclimatized, you shiver less. And by removing that shivering, you end up feeling more comfortable, because shivering makes you feel uncomfortable. So people who are used to going into cold water will cool more quickly. They'll have a hypothermic adaptation to cold, but they won't know that they're cooling because they'll feel comfortable. So you should not rely on the way you feel in the cold water. If you've gone beyond 5 or 10 minutes, you should not rely on how you feel in terms of determining whether you should go on or get out. You should be limiting your exposure by time, and certainly not going much beyond 5 or 10 minutes in very cold water, because it is possible to swim to unconsciousness. A guy called Phil Rush, who's one of only 2 people to swim the channel 3 times, told me that he now takes people across the Cook Strait, and he's actually got evidence of people being able to swim to unconsciousness. In fact, there's rather a salutary lesson with what happened with Jason Zerganos in the end. In 1953, tried to swim the Bosphorus. He was dragged out not feeling very well, and it was concluded that he'd been poisoned. In fact, he was hypothermic, but at no time had he felt cold because he was so acclimatized to the cold. In 1954, at the age of 46, he attempted to swim the 22-mile North Channel of the Irish Sea. Water temperature was about what it is now, between 9.4 and 11.7. After 6 hours and only 3 miles from the Scottish coast, he became unconscious, but he did not feel cold prior to this. He'd lost his behavioral, his sensory, his thermal comfort input into how he was. He was hauled from the water and a doctor using a penknife exposed his heart to reveal ventricular fibrillation. Direct heart massage having failed, JZ was pronounced dead at the scene. And finally, a guide to the time to spend in water. And I've already mentioned that time a few times, and we can discuss it some more if you want. We know that muscle function is decreased at a local temperature of 27 degrees. And so you can habituate to the cold shock response if you do it properly and carefully. And so hopefully that won't be a problem. But as I've said, you cannot habituate to the decline in physical function caused by neuromuscular cooling. And so really you're going to be physically incapacitated once your muscle temperatures get to about 27 degrees Celsius. This is an old piece of work from Barcroft and Edholm.